The Springboks have wisely reverted to tactics of days gone by and come up trumps in Cape Town. A 30 points to 22 win today over a very spirited Australian side. We did learn a lot from this game. Firstly, the Aussie revival of last week was not a flash in the pan. This game truly went down to the wire, and the Wallabies really could have snatched a win here had it not been for wayward lineout throws and wayward goal kicking. Now, ultimately, the Bokke did deserve the win. It was a gritty win. Wasn't very pretty today. Lots of handling errors out there. The ball was clearly greasy in Cape Town. We're going to talk about the condition of that turf. I'm going to use the word unprofessional. That was not suitable for an international game of rugby. And in fact, there was a potentially devastating injury in the 4th minute that I would chalk up to the quality of the pitch. We're going to also break down why some of the attacking woes have continued for the Springboks and where to from here for both of these teams. Before this match even started, there were a few changes to the team sheets. Slipper was out for Australia. Of course, James Slipper is the most capped prop, most capped Wallaby ever, so that was disappointing for the Aussies. But looking at the Springbok team sheet, I was quite aghast to see that Jean-Luc Depree was out. This guy just cannot catch a break. Hadn't started in 7 years before this year. He's going to have to wait a bit longer to log some more minutes as a starter for the Springboks. And then Willie le Roux was also out. So potentially you might have strengthened the team because you brought on Quagga Smith to start at 8 instead for the Springboks, and Apalele Fassi also came back into the mix at 15, and you had to wonder if he probably should have stayed out there anyway. I mean, with all due respect to Willie le Roux, the Centurion, he probably isn't going to factor into the World Cup plans as much as Apalele Fassi, so maybe better for Fassi to get back on the horse after a bit of a disappointing game last week, although I will say his form trend line did continue in this game. Now, Andre Pollard pretty much signaled straight away from his first touch of the ball, we are going Bok to basics here, Boaties. We are going to just kick the leather off this ball. That's what he did. He went for a crossfield bomb straight away, led to a breakdown penalty to South Africa, and I'm sure there was just a sigh of relief from Bokke fans everywhere thinking, oh boy, that's more like it. That's what we want to see. Familiar tactics indeed. Now, not long after that, we had our first scrum, and I was really taken aback by the fact that the Wallabies had a noticeably bigger pack than South Africa. How often can you say that? Particularly in the loose forwards. A little bit undersized there with Quagga, who's a great player, but certainly not the biggest man. If you look at the weight, though, the Wallabies really shaded them there. However, the Boks scrum was certainly better today. Let's give flowers to the forward pack from South Africa, including the replacements like Bowen Fenter, who came on. Scrum didn't really miss a beat. On a couple of occasions, they absolutely splintered the Aussie scrum. So that was a heartening sign if you're a South African fan. Now, I mentioned this dicey pitch earlier. Tom Wright, who is that mercurial, magical fullback for Australia, had one of the great counter-attacking tries in Australian history last week to help the Aussies get that famous win in Joburg. Well, he went down 4 minutes in. He wasn't tackled. No off-the-ball stuff. He simply twisted his foot in the turf. And I'm not a doctor. I can't assess him just from watching the game on TV, but based on his distraught expression, you had to fear that it was something serious. Now, in the 4th minute, the Boks had a monster scrum. They absolutely destroyed the Aussie front row, and Pollard slotted a kick. The Iceman. He was absolutely unerring with his boot today, and you just felt that one way or another, the Boks were going to kick the Wallabies to death. That's more or less how the game played out. But the Aussies were still in an adventurous mood, and in the 7th minute, an absolutely brilliant moment of heads-up play from Nick White, the 35-year-old Aussie halfback. Wallabies got a scrum penalty, and Nick White, I mean lightning quick, tapped the ball, grub it ahead, and Corey Toole on debut scores for Australia. Toole looked fantastic out there. He created so much today. If you've watched Super Rugby Pacific, you know that he really tears teams up with his pace. He's got that sevens background, so he's very skillful. But I believe he's the quickest man in the Wallabies. You could see it here on display, dotting down for a try. That really gave the Wallabies a bit of hope early on. In the 10th minute, Fassi and Moody scored for South Africa. How did it happen? Once again, Andre Pollard cross kick. Bit of a theme here. The Boks went to the air much more often. They did not want to play as wide as they did last week. Remember, those attacking breakdowns were real Achilles heel for South Africa. Not the case this week. Tightened up the game a little bit there, but also didn't put themselves in harm's way. Played it tighter, played it smarter, and given the wet conditions, that greasy ball, how treacherous the pitch was, you have to say that the Boks were right to adopt this game plan. In the 18th minute, some more promising Aussie attack. Clearly, the Aussies were trying to isolate the South African fullback and the wingers, and it was a tactic that seemed to be bearing a little bit of fruit. Now, unfortunately, Nick White went off, so 2 huge losses for the Aussies. You know, Wright and White were, I mean, you could argue they were the best backs on the field last week, apart from James O'Connor, who pulled the strings well. So already the Aussies were in a bit of a hole early, just from the point of view of having all of their best personnel on the field. They certainly don't have the depth of South Africa. So Tate McDermott was on at halfback, and he broke on attack, and he was actually so quick that he got isolated from his teammates and got turned over by Marco van Staden, who had a pretty useful game for South Africa. Definitely seemed to be committed to cleaning up the breakdowns. That was clearly his main chore for the day, and he did have a reasonably good presence at the breakdown. Nevertheless, after a bit of back and forth play, the Wallabies get a penalty and they kick for the corner. So at this point, there are 2 kickable penalties that they've turned down, potentially 6 points left behind. Keep that in mind as we end up at this final score here. The Aussies set up a promising rolling maul, but the Boks turned them over and they kicked out of danger. So you have to say that 6 points have already gone begging for the Aussies, just as Andre Pollard is absolutely nailing his goals. In the 34th minute, Quagga Smith, the late replacement, he scores a try for South Africa off the back of a huge surge from Ox Inche, who perhaps was answering some critics this week who had questioned his mobility. He certainly was a bit spicier around the field, as well as being his usual reliable self at the set piece this week. Now, in the 39th minute, that same man, Quagga Smith, who he was all action. I mean, he was giving away penalties, he was scoring tries, he was winning ball, like he was doing a bit of everything in this game. But he was off his feet on defense, did have a penalty go against him at the breakdown. The Aussies were looking tired on attack at this point. It looked like they just wanted to get to the shed and regroup. So for the first time, O'Connor actually takes the points on the hooter. He gets the ball over the crossbar. So it is 20 points to 10. South Africa in the lead at halftime. Probably a fair reflection of the game at that point. You had to think that maybe the Aussies might have been better off taking the points on occasion, but really that's hindsight talking. And in general, the Wallabies have benefited from rolling the dice. It's sort of in their DNA to gamble a bit, go for the attacking play. Certainly worked last week, so can't fault their decision-making there. But South Africa seemed to have a reasonable grip on the game at halftime. In the 45th minute, the Wallabies struck off a scrum. James O'Connor decides to emulate Andre Pollard. He kicks the ball. It's a lovely kick, and and Moody absolutely makes a hash of the bouncing ball. He was covering for Fassi. Look, the Aussies did well to draw the Boks up pretty flat here. It looked like they might run. Instead, they kicked, and so there was really an empty backfield for South Africa, nicely exploited by Australia. And you would have to say that Fassi and Moody were sort of having shockers out there. Uncharacteristic mistakes. What can you say? You know, Fassi has just looked so good in the past year or so, but he has come into a pretty diabolical streak of bad form lately. You have to think he's talented enough to turn it around, and this is just an aberration in his young career. But so many mistakes today from Fassi. I was pretty surprised to see it. Now, a lot of people were making handling errors, including Damien Dialende, you know, all of the familiar, experienced, wizened veterans. But even so, Fassi and Moody would have probably disappointed a lot of South African followers today. Speaking of, and Moody gets pulled off in the 54th minute. Sasha Feinberg Mngomezulu comes on, doesn't replace Pollard at 10. SFM goes to fullback, which was pretty interesting to see. Springboks are attacking. Iki Tau from Australia, the number 12. He's caught offside on D, and so Pollard opens up a 6-point lead, nailing his 5th kick out of 5. They don't call him the Iceman for nothing, let me tell you. He never looked like missing today. In the 63rd minute, Corey Toole, he broke and he chipped ahead. Boy, rugby is a cruel game. If the ball had just bounced a little bit towards the touchline, you felt that Toole would have been in. It did bounce towards the South African covering defense. He was a little bit unlucky there. The Boks win their scrum near their own line, clean, and Corbus Reinek, who has at this point replaced Grant Williams at halfback, he clears the ball out of jail for South Africa. In the 67th minute, Eben Etzebeth is drawn offside. A few errors from the big man, but as we'll discuss in a moment, also a pretty heroic play to seal the game for the Springboks. Now the Wallabies kick for the corner. The replacement hooker, Paenga Amosa, he throws true. Unlike Pollard, who was not getting that ball in straight for Australia throughout the game. Probably 3 or 4 lineouts went awry for the Aussies up to this point in time. But not only did the new hooker throw the ball in true and then play his part in a rolling maul, it seemed that he was the man who dotted the ball down. So they scored a try there, a much-needed try, as the 70th minute was approaching. But James O'Connor hooks his kick left. So the Aussies are still down by a point. James O'Connor's goal kicking. Yikes. In the 71st minute, the Boks spot that the Wallabies have an empty backfield. They kick. James O'Connor does well to scramble, get back, get his mitts on the ball, but he is under all kinds of pressure. He fires off a very low pass, a way too low pass, to Callaway, who knocks the ball on. We now have a Springbok scrum dead center, close to the 22. I wrote down, this will be game over. Now, I'm not Nostradamus, but I could see this coming a mile away. The Springboks put in a mighty scrum. They earn advantage. Pick and go, and Eben Etzebeth scores. Pollard converts. This was just like the Springboks of old. This is exactly what you'd expect. You know, great scrum. Relentless phases built quickly, and then a big man dotting over the line. Andre Pollard adds the cherry on top. I mean, this was sort of just the familiar sight you wanted to see as a Springbok fan, even if it wasn't pretty. But this is what you wanted to see after the horror show last week, and you got it. I'm thinking at this point the 8-point buffer is definitely going to be enough for the Springboks to just kill the clock. The Wallabies did keep fighting, though. They fired up a nice attack off the back of an Eben Etzebeth bobble, but the ball gets turned over by Cheslin Colby. However, we go back because it turns out that number 23 for South Africa, Sasha Feinberg Ngomazulu, made a high tackle somewhere in there. So it's time for the Aussies to take the points. So I'm thinking, okay, they could get a losing bonus point here, or maybe, you know, if they get 3, then there is still a minute or two to pull off an improbable try. As I'm calculating all of that, James O'Connor misses. He sprays it right this time, overcorrecting for that left hook. Ugh, poor guy. Missed 2 shots in a row there. Later on, Apalele Fassi gets a yellow card for deliberately knocking on the ball. I mentioned he did not have a great game. Well, the yellow card was kind of the final ignominy. James O'Connor doesn't have the length, missing his 3rd kick in a row. He's got the accuracy, but he doesn't have the length to claim a penalty. Get the Aussies that bonus point. It's close, but no cigar. Ultimately, the Boks hold on. It's Bok to business. 30 points to 22 is the final score. Well, while this will have settled the nerves of South African fans, it was not in any way the comprehensive display you would have liked, but it was a controlled game. It was a measured game. They did well narrowing up their attack, and you just have to think that maybe playing territory is going to be the way to go against the All Blacks coming up at Eden Park, rather than trying to run the ball out of their own 22, out of their own half, as they've been doing in the domestic tests this year. I think we're going to see a little bit of a hybrid. They're going to play with a bit more width, but go back to the kicking 10 option a little bit more, create those contestables. The Boks did well in the air in the first half, but the Aussies actually started winning the aerial battle a little bit more in the second half. That kept them in the game. No real issues with the Springbok set piece. No matter who was on there, the scrum looked strong today. But massive question marks about some of your backs. I mean, as I mentioned, Moody, Fassi, by their standards, pretty poor games. The old firm of Damien Dialendi and Captain Jesse Creel, they look good in the centers. Couple of handling errors, but hey, everybody was making them. That ball was like a bar of soap. And, you know, it's hard to assess the back row because it was such a makeshift formation. Mostert did pretty well. As I mentioned, Marco van Staden at 6 had some damaging runs, was a reasonably strong presence at the breakdown. But I think it's going to be a while before we see that back row combination for South Africa again, unless Peter Steph Toy and Sia Khaleesi are really going to be out for a while. In terms of the locks, I mean, Eben Etzebeth showed his class when he came on, even if he did make some mistakes. Arke Snyman, he looked good out there in the mid-row. Ludiaga, not bad when he came on. You know, it was all pretty solid stuff, if unspectacular, from the South African big men, but they did enough to ultimately squeeze the life out of the Aussies, and you have to just take your hats off to them. Sometimes you just need a win. This was a bit of a do-or-die moment for South Africa. They did not want to lose 2 in a row to the Aussies at home, and ultimately the Springboks will retain the Mandela Challenge plate, so good for them. Keep the trophy in the cabinet. They'll be relieved about that. But what do you guys think? Is this just a little bit of a temporary slip for the Springboks, or do you think there's some cracks showing? Is age catching up with some of the older players? Comment below. Send this video to someone who loves rugby. Like, subscribe, and I will be back later today to break down the All Blacks versus Argentina. Cannot wait. Love these rugby championship weekends. I'll see you guys then. Take it easy. Bye for now.